For all you wonderful teachers out there, I've got a big question for you. How much of your time is spent speaking in the classroom instead of listening to your students? Now, for most of us, the reality is that the answer to this question can be quite sobering because we spend so much more time speaking to our students than we do listening to them. And did you know that some of the research even suggests that some students can go through an entire day without having any communication with another human being whatsoever, let alone their teachers? It's heartbreaking stuff, isn't it? Now, this raises the question, why does this happen? And I think a lot of this can be traced back to this all-important topic of effective communication in the classroom, or what we can refer to as dynamic discourse. Now, that's just a fancy way that researchers describe the events that transpire in the communication between teachers and students. And it's an important topic because it can take up such a huge chunk of what happens in the classroom, and therefore it can have an enormous impact on how students engage in the learning process. Now, if this topic of dynamic discourse in the classroom piques your interest, and you want to learn more about how to have a huge impact in the way you communicate in the classroom, then today's episode of the Powerful Learning Podcast is for you. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, where our mission is to help you know more, do more, and be more by delving into the science of effective learning and teaching. My name's Luke Rowe, and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. In today's podcast, we'll be tackling the topic of dynamic discourse in the classroom with Dr. Sophie Specjal. We'll cover a wide range of ideas that are jam-packed with practical tips to inform your teaching and learning practice, including when to speak and when to listen, how to ask questions and provide prompts to your students, how to set up the preconditions necessary for effective communication, as well as a number of reflective and action-orientated steps that you can take to ensure that your students can navigate the journey from surface to deep knowledge in your classroom. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, don't forget to subscribe so that you can be notified of future episodes, and please leave us a review so that others can discover our material and join the Powerful Learning community. So without further ado, I bring you my discussion with Dr. Sophie Specjal. Welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, Sophie Specjal. It's great to have you on board.
Thank you, Luke.
Well, today we're going to be talking about dynamic discourse for deep learning in the classroom. And I'm excited about this topic because it's a timely topic, I think, for a lot of teachers, often overlooked and neglected. And I think your perspective on this is it sort of bucks the trends of convention. And I think you're going to offer some unique insights. And I'm excited to get those ideas out there into this wide world of the podcasting audience. So let's dive into it by getting to know a little bit more about you. So can you share with us a little bit about who you are and how you came to be an educational researcher on classroom discourse?
Thanks, Luke. It's terrific to be here. To give you a little bit of a context about me personally, I've always wanted to be a teacher, and I was a teacher for many, many years. And I started off as a primary school teacher and then moved into different curriculum roles. I was always looking for something that was where I could be learning about much more about teaching and learning. And in between having two wonderful children who are now 18 and 15, I did some work on special ed. I was really interested in the area of special education and working with children with individual needs. And so I did that, and that was wonderful. And then I moved into a role that was a K-12 role that allowed me to really look quite deeply at curriculum and curriculum implementation. And at that time, John Hattie was still in New Zealand, but I heard him speak and I was really intrigued and interested in what he had to say. And he also mentioned that he was moving to Melbourne. And I thought, gosh, that's quite timely. I might look at doing some extra study and I'd love to know more about his work. This goes back to about 2012 when he just released Visible Learning for Teachers. And so we met up and spoke for about 2 hours that first day. And one of the things, and I'd read through his work, and one of the things that fascinated me was the notion of dialogue versus monologue. One of his 10 mind frames. And, I kind of, that day that John and I spoke for a few hours, I said, I want to research it all. And, one of the things that he'd said to me, and I'm sure that, like you, being one of his PhD students too, that, you've really got to hone this down. You've got to really work out, what area are you truly interested in? And as I mentioned, the notion of dialogue versus monologue really interests me. But it interested me when I spoke to him that day. I said to him, I actually think that I'm not sure about what you're saying about this. You're telling teachers to stop talking, but I actually love to talk. And I think that it's what makes me a great teacher. I think that being so passionate and involved in the lesson, it's my superpower. That's what I said to him on that day. And he stopped me fairly promptly and said, okay, Sophie, so that's great, but have you ever asked your students about this?
Ooh, burning question, that one.
Yeah, that's right. And I said to him, no. And then I said, but let me think about this. So when I'm talking to them, they're like smiling and they're nodding. But as I was saying that, I felt really silly and I thought, oh my gosh, maybe they don't love me talking as much as I love
so
talking.
He inspired a productive self-doubt in you.
But I was like, but then he said, oh, I love this. Like, that'd be a great topic to start with because, it's a superpower and, hey, let's get into it. Because of that, I started with some master's research as I was in this big K-12 role at an independent school in Melbourne. And I thought, okay, well, given that I have never asked the students about it, I'm going to actually start this research with a big questionnaire and asking 600 kids from year 4 to year 12, because it was a K-12 school, about teacher talk and teachers who talk too much. So that's where I started.
What a bold step, because you risk having the kind of confrontation with cold reality. It suggests that you may not be as grandiose at teaching as you originally thought. All those nods and smiles, maybe they're just misleading cues. But, good on you for taking that bold step. And ironically, that came out of dialogue with John and not monologue. So that's an organic reflection of your interests.
My bubble was burst fairly quickly at that point. When lit reviews and really reading about research that I hadn't really done as a teacher, and looking quite deeply at research in this area, that it wasn't just me, it was every teacher, that all teachers love to talk. I thought it was just, me and a few of us, but it was actually pretty much everyone.
Yeah. And look, you can see why there's that kind of superficial understanding of teaching as a talk fest, because, I think if you ask if you could reduce teaching practice down to one behavior, what would it look like? Most people would probably converge on talking and a teacher standing up in what's a stereotype of a teacher? Standing up there, they've got the chalkboard or the whiteboard or the smart board behind them, they're talking to the class, and they're bestowing their wisdom to these naive young minds, and of course shaping them and molding them as they speak. But it's not that simple, right? And you're peeling back the layers of that onion of complexity on this wonderful topic. Tell me though, was there ever a moment or a circumstance where you're like, yep, got to quit my job as a teacher, go headfirst into researching classroom discourse along that way? Or did you get scared off by that initial literature review?
No, I was actually intrigued by it. I thought that by being a talker and loving to talk in all contexts in life, like loving to talk to people everywhere and everywhere I go, like just talking and listening. So I do think that there was a part of that sits on the other side. The thing was that it really made me think quite deeply about the fact that we don't plan for talk. So we'll plan for content, but we don't plan for talk so much. And so, it allowed one of the statements that actually came from John as well at that time was, if you're talking all the time, are the students in your class just coming to school to watch you work? And so again, it was another really
cold reality.
It was a cold reality, but it really allowed me to stop and evaluate my practice and say, well, when I'm talking, I want to make a difference. And that's what I think most teachers absolutely want to do. They want to make a difference and they want to know how to do it. And if they're enthusiastic about it, like when I was talking in my class, I'd be like, oh, and just one more thing. And what about this? And what about that? Or I might go off track, or I might, but I'm always leading the discussion. And one of the cold realities as well, and I know we've spoken about this before, was the notion of kids going through the day not actually having a conversation with anybody. So if I'm
tragic, it's like it haunts me to think that that's possible, and like it's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking, and so often we won't notice it. And then as we sort of delved more into the research, it was about so that there was lesson flow, that teachers would perhaps ask certain students, because they know if they were questioning, that they would ask them certain questions, and they knew that there was still lesson flow, and so the lesson could continue and they could continue to talk. But for the kids that sit quietly, and the scary bit is that they've learnt that, and they've learnt how to do that really well, to sit quietly, not be a problem in their class, and therefore go through the entire day without speaking to anyone. We don't want that. And even for kids who do want that, we want to change that narrative to even challenge them by allowing kids to think together. So I think that if we actually want kids to think together, we must pass on and provide the opportunities for them to talk.
Yeah. I was chatting to our friend and previous colleague, Dr. Amy Berry. She has this wonderful term for students who are in the classroom physically but not mentally, emotionally, or intellectually. She calls it passively disengaged. And these are students who can fly under the radar without actively engaging in any dialogue with the teacher, or they're only just passing the bare minimum viability of showing that they're doing the work, and often that's kind of their goal, is to just fly under the radar. And it's a tragedy that we miss out on having their voice in the classroom, having their input in the classroom. And we as educators don't get to have an accurate insight into what's going on in their heads. And so we miss out. We have an impoverished view of teaching because of having an impoverished view of the students' learning and their engagement in the learning.
When I asked those 600 students and gave them a questionnaire that John Hattie and I developed together, what happened was something very interesting. So we talk about content, we talk about voice, we talk about a lot of the research that was out there was about the amount of teacher talk. So I think it's actually important to start there first. I think that for all of us to understand that there's been such a big debate about the amount of teacher talk and teachers needing to stop talking. But when we did ask the students and we put together those results of the questionnaire, what we found was 3 really clear groups emerged. But out of all of the groups, every single student, they disliked high amounts of teacher talk. Secondly, they actually said that all of the teachers talk too much. So that's a problem straight away.
So they dislike it and they recognise that it's actually a reality.
It's a problem.
Yep.
Thirdly, the interesting part is that this group of students disliked teacher talk more than any of the other groups. However, they wouldn't change anything about the way these particular teachers, they had to write the names of specific teachers, they actually wouldn't change anything about the way that these teachers were talking.
So when asked with how they could remedy the what they've recognised as a problem in the classroom of the teacher talking too much, when asked how could they solve that problem and fix that, they've said they wouldn't change the teachers talking.
Change it, but they disliked it. So I was like, what? Do we,
what a paradox.
We need to redo this, or what's going on, John?
So that was the turning point. That was where you were like, yep, I've got to go all in, jump into this whole research field. And
because it was challenging my views as a teacher to say, okay, well, I need to stop talking because the kids don't like it as much as I thought. But hang on a minute. To find out what these particular teachers did, we actually used what was called the visible classroom that Professor Janet Clinton was leading a hearing impaired project at the University of Melbourne using AI media and a voice captioning service to really start to look at the way that the way that those teachers, as part of their bigger project and a big part of an EF overseas project in the UK, I was able to
Educational Endowment Foundation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So they were part of a very big project with visible learning, with visible Clasroom, and using AI media to caption the discourse of these teachers. And so I
so this is in Australian classrooms.
This was in
all
UK
around the world.
classrooms.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And thousands and thousands and thousands of UK classrooms.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was actually doing some extra work and coding with Visible Classroom. And I just thought, gosh, this would be a great tool to use to find out more about my teachers that I needed.
It was a treasure trove for your topic.
Yeah. So could I use this in the Australian context and get... They were using real-time live captioning, much like, TV captioning. I didn't need that. I just needed it to be captioned and then it to be looked at carefully and then correlated with or compared to the larger data that they had put together to see what was standing out, or indeed was anything standing out about these particular teachers. So something that came out with those teachers, and this kind of comes back to that initial question of, what is going to work and what are those strategies, or what can teachers do? And so what I found was that as far as questioning went with their teacher talk, that these teachers asked much fewer questions themselves. So what we know about questioning is that often teachers can ask between 200 to 400, and I know that's a big variance, but
wow,
at 200 to 400 questions a day.
As in 200 to 400 or two?
No, 200 to 400.
Oh, okay.
So let's start at 200.
Like two, as in 1, 2.
Yeah, no.
Right up to 400. That's huge.
But hold
variation.
on to that thought of 2, because that's how many questions they found that as a class students were asking.
Ouch!
So,
no.
Yeah. And I know that it's interesting because when I've consulted or presented or done a keynote or a workshop overseas or in Australia, I ask that question of, how often, what's the percentage that you think teachers are talking for, or the types of questions? And it's certainly a lot less than what the research says. Every time I will have teachers who will then make contact with me and say, gosh, Sophie, I evaluated my practice that day, or I timed myself, or I looked at it, and I too.
Rude awakening.
So, whilst you may think, no, that's not me, I think for any teacher that's listening, I think that evaluate your practice. Have a think about, am I actually speaking for a long period of time? Am I asking throughout a day 200 to 400 questions? The other part of the research was this notion of surface to deep, that was many of the questions or much of the content was surface. So for me, I needed to find out, what did that actually mean? And that was the teacher in me, as opposed to, I guess, the researcher, is when you say in all these research papers, surface level learning, deeper level learning, what does it mean and what does it look like? And so, when we can talk a bit more about that later, but I use the solo taxonomy as a framework to help.
Johnny Biggs.
Yep. Biggs and Collis used that framework to highlight the verbs that are similar to Bloom's as well, except for varies that there are 6 and, there are 4. But again, that's probably a whole nother topic. But this idea of understanding what deep and surface was. So going back to these teachers, they asked fewer questions, but their students asked more questions. So that generalization of sort of 1 to 2 questions that students ask per lesson, it was a lot more. Prompting. So there was a lot.
So it's kind of like, just to clarify this, it's kind of like a bit of a seesaw, in the sense that you've got a teacher who asks fewer questions is promoting or giving space to students to ask more questions of them. Is that kind of how you're seeing this?
Yeah, that's right. Or they're providing the opportunity for students to ask the questions, or they're intentionally planning for students to ask more questions.
Right.
And I think for these teachers, there was nothing that was intentional. It was, we were capturing who they were without an intentional framework that had been developed within the school. This is like capturing who the kids thought were really effective, but it really aligned with what the research said.
Yeah. This idea of teachers finding out when looking at themselves through, I guess, a fresh set of eyes that have been, educated by you and your insights, and they come to this understanding that, hang on, I might be actually talking too much in my classroom, not asking enough questions or giving enough space for students. What was the next step for them? Were they empowered by that process, or was it kind of like a kick in the guts?
I know as part of that EEF project that they actually worked with students and, they worked with teachers, and the teachers significantly changed their practice. So the teachers who were talking way too much and who weren't questioning effectively began to evaluate their practice. And we saw, I think Janet Clinton was on the Revolution School, way back, many years ago. She used the visible classroom then, and the same thing happened when teachers were coached through that. It's hugely confronting to say, actually, I talk a lot. And since doing this research and I consult in schools and work with school leadership and work with individual teachers, when I get them to think about their teacher talk and again, there's that, no, I think that I'm very much inclusive of students, and there's a lot of student voice in my classroom. I do love to talk, but, I think I've got the right balance. Once we really start to unpack that, and there's that coaching process of, all right, well, let's have a look at it together. And, this is what we both noticed.
Yeah.
It's pretty confronting. And I don't know that there's been a teacher yet, well, there hasn't, where they've gone, oh, great, I'm not talking too much. Like they're talking too much. And so
there's an asymmetry to this challenge, right? Where there are very few or perhaps no teachers are underdoing the talking, they're actually overdoing the talking. So that's part of the asymmetry there. And so when they're confronted with that reality, though, you're saying as bitter a pill as that is to swallow, it's actually quite helpful to improve their practice. You're saying that this can be the beginning of a really productive journey for a teacher in their own self-discovery of who they are as an effective or not so effective educator, and how they can be on their pathway to learning more, becoming a student of their own craft.
Absolutely. And the other thing, the great thing that came from that study one from that PhD research, was that there were a few strategies that then added on, because it's all good and well to say, stop talking. But if you remember that initial part of the questionnaire, all of the students disliked teacher talk. All of the students said, they wanted the teachers to talk less. However, this group wouldn't change. So as we delved more into this group, what we found was that one of the really big effects that was happening, or a teaching strategy, was prompting. So these teachers were using prompting and cues throughout their lesson. And if you look at feedback research, and I know you've spoken to Luke as well, who was part of our team, that the importance of feedback, but one of the really high, an area that has a really enormous effect size is cues and prompting when we're looking at feedback. And these teachers were using this feedback strategy, but prompting and cues to seek more from their students.
So they're soliciting this dialogue. They're not just sitting there passively waiting for it to happen.
And they're not going, okay, so asking a question, and then it's just that's it. That's the end of the question. They're prompting, and they're also teaching students how to use prompting and cues quite intentionally.
By example, or by actually explaining to students how to ask better questions and make better prompts?
Well, look, that came later in my next study 2 and 3 that were.
I'm skipping ahead. Let's build up to that.
Back to that. But the other 2 areas that they were definitely doing differently, and remember the comparison was to this, 4,000 odd teachers that were in the UK, but again, it aligned with the research, was these teachers were clearly always setting goals. They were visible and they were used throughout the lesson. So goal setting was key, and deep learning. So again,
what sort of goals? Learning goals, or like the teachers are setting personal goals for their own instructional approaches, or what sort of goals would they be?
They were learning goals. So they were.
Okay.
I found that when we, were really listening in, the teachers were clear about the learning intention. Now, I know that intentions and success criteria there's so many misconceptions around that. And in fact, a lot of work I've had to do a lot of work in that area because it gets a bit of a bad rap. And I think that
Dylan William, big critic of that.
Absolutely.
He mocks it quite a bit.
He does, but he's also one that says, you should do that too.
Yes, so I think his bone to pick is how you do it is more important than just ticking the boxes.
Absolutely. And I think that comes back to sort of that backbone of talk. It's how you do it.
Yeah, it's the quality.
It's the quality. So the teachers, there was a clarity. So when I listened to these lessons, there was a clarity of the kids knew where they were, where they needed to go, how they were going to get there. And they
Hattie Timperley model, boom.
Yep, boom. But they did, and this is where it aligns with the research. So when we read things like the Hattie Timperley feedback model, that we can actually see it in action, that teachers are really clear about the purpose of why the kids are, what are we doing? And it's not just
learning goals 101.
Yeah, and the deep level learning came through, this connects to the goal setting. So often teachers will use, what we call a WALT or a WILF. What are we learning today? If we're just focused on the what are we learning today, we can't possibly go deep because it's just this kind of isolated lesson that sits on its own.
What's in front of your nose?
Front kind of roadmap of, this is where we're going. Yeah, for the next couple of weeks. But, this is the process that we're going to go through.
Yeah.
These areas of question prompting, teacher talk, goal setting and deep learning then led into the big chunk of the next part of my research. The next phase of my research was taking and really being fortunate enough to use the interaction classroom that was part of the Science of Learning Research Centre at the University of Melbourne.
Yeah.
I always call it the Big Brother class. So, it's where kids are like Big Brother, the show. You've got this two-way screen, you've got people behind, you've got multiple areas being filmed.
We're referencing the modern TV show, not the George Orwell book, for any listeners out there, right? So we're talking about something a little more savoury than George Orwell's work, where there's a classroom at the University of Melbourne. It was a part of the Science Learning Research Centre that Sophie and I were a part of, and it had a space for about 50 people to engage in classroom activities. So it was a classroom laboratory with, I think there was over 20 cameras in there. There was thermal mapping of the classroom, so you could do geospatial mapping of students and how they interacted with one another physically. But they also had the capacity to mic up every single person and to dissociate the contributions to the conversation per student, which is a fairly unique setting. Definitely huge investment on UniMelb's part, but the fruits of that were very evident in your research as well as my own, and we're both thankful for that. So tell us what happened in that classroom.
So the reason I wanted to use that classroom is one of the areas that as I delved into PhD research, was Graham Nuttall's work in the Hidden Lives of Learners. And
Rest in peace, Graham Nuttall. Amazing work.
Yeah, he's done amazing work, and he didn't publish enough, I don't think. I think that there's just so much that was there that he did over so long. But what he did, for the listeners who are not aware of his work, is that he mic'd up students in secondary schools, and he listened and he did transcripts of what they were saying to code and to analyse classroom discourse. And what I found really interesting was that if I was truly studying teacher talk, that I really needed to understand student talk as well. It ended up being a lot more challenging, I have to say, than I thought initially. I actually got 3 teachers from 3 different sectors. So one from Catholic, one from independent, and one from the state. So again, here's 3 teachers. I worked really closely with those 3 teachers to come up with a surface lesson, a deep lesson, and a transfer lesson. Again, based on the Solo taxonomy, really focusing on those verbs so that we could think about a lesson. So, for example, a surface lesson being something that was about rote and recitation, or a close activity where there was just something that was right and wrong. A deep level lesson where it was comparing similarities and differences. So I needed to have that knowledge of what something was to be able to compare it. And a transfer lesson, taking what was learnt previously and putting it into a new context.
Yeah, generalising it and drawing inferences.
Right.
Yeah.
So what each of those teachers had to do, and they were amazing, so brave to go in and be filmed in the interaction classroom with their kids who were so excited. We didn't show the kids straight away all of the TVs and all of the things that they could see out the back until the end.
Yeah. So for those who are listening, it's got a one-way mirror where the audio technicians hide behind and the researchers hide behind that one-way mirror so that it's not intimidating to those who are performing and the teaching duties and the students in the room. So that's the idea of it being a kind of fly-on-the-wall laboratory.
Yeah, that's right. And so they taught their lessons, and those 5 areas that came up about questioning, prompting, teacher talk, goal setting, and deep learning, we really wanted to integrate those things just to see if, because it was actually about what the students were saying. So again, going back to Nuttall, he had found so many different things that I wanted to see, could we replicate his work? Could we find and achieve similar findings about student talk and teacher talk? I mean, the interesting part was, Luke, that when we're trying to be quite tech savvy and timely, so we sent all of the recordings over to San Francisco to be transcribed professionally. But this is where talk gets really complicated. When we got it back, the context, the Australian context, just couldn't be transcribed. So obviously the individual people who were transcribing this data, essentially, of every student, so it was every single student was heard. So it was every table and every student. And there was over 26,000 lines of discourse that needed to be
Get overwhelming when you're doing a PhD.
I was like, wow, oh gosh.
You'll get that done in 20 years' time, don't worry.
Yeah, I'm a teacher. I'm not a researcher. What do I do here? So it was a lot, but it gave enormous insights. Not a lot of people over the years and decades have actually tackled analysing student talk. There's so much of the analysis of teacher talk. And like I said, the teacher talk really sits in the amount of teacher talk if we're looking at, just stop talking, but it's so much more complex. When it comes to analysing student interactions and student talk, there wasn't a lot of things there. And I guess I know why now, because it is so difficult. And when you're looking at even a table of 4 students, so I had in my classrooms with the teachers, there was 4 students at a table, and each student had a mic in front of them, and each table was recognised, and then each student was recognised. So we had like a number allocated to each line spoken. We had a number allocated to everything the teacher said, each lesson, the surface, deep, and transfer, each of the table groups. I then looked at as teachers would know, the introduction of the lesson, or within the lesson, like were there changes. I looked at the intention of the lesson. We made sure, because of the previous work with Visible Classroom, that the teachers had a visible learning intention. We then looked at the chunk of discourse that was aligned to each what's called conversational sequence. One of the bits that I looked at was the discourse on task or off task? Because in Graham Nuttall's research, there was so much of that talk that was off task, and did it matter? We looked at gender, who was talking. We looked at the student's statement of discourse. So was it surface, deep, or transfer within a surface, deep, and transfer lesson? We used the Bloom verbs, and we used solo verbs, just to see if there was a difference and to really make sure that we were doing the right things when we were looking at surface and deep. We used this really cool coding system that came from Cambridge University, and under one of the people whose work I follow, Neil Mercer. And
yeah,
Sarah,
been in touch with Neil before. His research is wonderful.
And he's such a generous person with his time. He's written enormously as part of the Oracy Cambridge University, and I would recommend anyone who is listening to look up the Cambridge University Oracy work that's happened over the years under people like Sarah Hennessy and Neil Mercer. And they came up with this great coding system that was for student interactions with a collaboration with the University of Mexico and through Rogus and Drummond's work. in looking at the way that kids interacted with each other to help teachers. What T. Cedar was saying, that these coding categories that worked, what they found worked, and what they really wanted to code to see if it was within the discourse or the student talk, they were all quite deep.
So the teacher has to intentionally, construct the architecture of the dialogue in the classroom for you to get there. So that this stuff reach the deeper level in those deeper level learning lessons, or was this something that you were finding were happening within each of those surface, deep, and transfer across all three?
Well, that is a great question, because it was a question that initially I hadn't even considered. But as I started to bring all of and analyze all of it together, it was one of my biggest wonderings about when does this happen? And I did this like heat map of the surface to deep, the transfer lesson for students and for teachers. And I found that in every single lesson, and this blew John and others away when we went, oh my God, these kids, when they've got the opportunity to talk. So remember, the teachers have been asked not to talk.
Right.
And I can tell you,
I can see where this is going.
When we were in there, I had to actually stop one of the teachers to say, please remember, this is not about your teacher talk. We really want to capture the student talk. It is so hard, even when we know we've got to stop talking. And, she was like, oh gosh, I didn't even realize. But the interesting part was when we did this, what was quality discourse analysis through T. Cedar layered with everything else, we found in every single lesson that the kids went from surface to deep. They were doing those things.
And was that on their own or with the teacher guidance? Was there some kind of circumstantial facilitators of reaching that level of deep that was on the basis of how the teacher was constructing a lesson? Or did it just happen when the teacher gave way to the students running the show? Did it just organically emerge like that?
The only thing that the teachers were given were those 5 prompts from the beginning that came from those 5 effective teachers, as found to be effective by the students. The questioning, asking fewer, asking them to question more. The prompting, so rather than talking, the prompting, but the clear goal setting about what the lesson was about. The other thing, and the deep level learning and the lack of teacher talk. The other thing that we really made sure that we did, and I don't think we knew the power of it until the end, was that the tasks aligned to each lesson. So the cognitive task development, the cognitive task matched the intention of the lesson. If the lesson was to identify features of persuasive text, there was a persuasive text that was collaborative. It wasn't on its own. It was one bit of text that they had to highlight features of persuasive text. Conversation still went deep. So even though it was a surface task, the conversation still went deep. That second lesson of, like a comparison of using a Venn diagram to compare similarities and difference between text, the cognitive task matched the cognitive talk that was being used by the teacher. It was quite exceptional. And I think that thinking back to my own teaching and as a head of curriculum and certainly consulting, it's another thing that is probably not explicit enough is, when we've got this roadmap of surface to deep and when we're talking, do the tasks actually align with the cognitive ability of what that phase of where the kids are meant to be? And let's use that language and prompt that language. The teachers didn't have T. Cedar. T. Cedar came, as I was delving into, gosh, how am I going to analyse 25,000 lines of discourse?
How to eat the elephant one bite at a time.
We can laugh about it now.
Yeah, I know the pain.
So that was fascinating, and it really makes me think about planning for talk and getting teachers to plan for talk.
Oh, yeah. This is this crazy kind of revolutionary way of looking at how the classroom unfolds with the dialogue in the classroom. There's just nothing unintentional about that in a highly effective teaching environment. It is the teacher is the architect of the learning in that environment. And it's from what you're saying, there's so many levers to be able to pull on that whole equation of how to make it more effective for students. And what's nice to know is that you can have surface to deep learning with everything that you do. That sounds like there's an opportunity there for teachers, no matter what kind of level of the topic or level of the Bloom's taxonomy or Solo taxonomy that they're originally addressing, that you can still go deep. And that means for all students, there's a whole world of being able to differentiate for those different levels of interest and engagement and ability there.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the things was that when these lessons were set up, they were intentionally set up for kids to talk. And I think that as teachers, we need to think, even about the general architecture of our rooms. Do we have our rooms even set up for collaborative discourse? Do we have, are we planning for allowing students to be able to look at each other and talk to each other?
Are you a big fan of open classrooms for that reason, or do you think that they stifle, or do they help or hinder that kind of collaboration?
I don't think it matters, to be honest. I don't think it's about the open or closed classroom. I think it's like what Hattie talks about it. It does come back to the teacher and the way that we're utilizing. It's about the talk, and so whether or not when I'm going into a lot of classrooms, and particularly secondary classrooms, there might be a big horseshoe, or there might be, single lines. And I would say that's okay if you think that very easily in a 50-minute lesson that you can turn chairs around and that kids can look at each other and talk.
Right. So that's what you're more concerned about, not the seating arrangement of how things begin. But once you want to promote the student collaboration and dialogue together, you've got to have some kind of capacity for them to set up the environment that's conducive of that.
And I also think it's important to look at, again, one of the research components that was really fascinating to me when I initially began chatting to John was about looking at the impact and the effect size of, and you, I'm sure that you're very well aware of all of this, is with group work that it was 0.4. So, 0.4 being a year's growth for a year's worth of schooling. I would have thought when I looked at that it would be much higher and much greater. His collaborative work that's 0.4 or 0.41. Why is it so low? I mean, it's not like negative, but it's not having an enormous impact. Why is that? And so even if the tables are set up, as a group of 4, teachers can still talk in a very monological way and still have that ownership of talking. So the tables are a starting point.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about the way that we use group work and talk, and that is, giving students roles that they're more focused on the role than they are with the thinking or the question or the deep level learning. And so we should really have those expectations for all. So teaching kids how to use some keywords and key phrases by modelling them ourselves. And so I think that's something like the prompting comes in, and changing our discourse so that we're very clear about the purpose of what the lesson is, where the students need to go, and then using those prompts and cues, but also teaching the kids to say things like, if they're inviting, other kids to take part, is, can you add to that? Tell me more about that. Can you rephrase that? It makes me think, or, I used to think, but now I think, like a really great thinking routine.
I was going to say, I want to pick your brain on a couple of things, because I know that time is probably limited. And, I've followed Doug Lemov, who's the author of Teach Like a Champion, and I'm sure you know of Doug, and he's such an incredible guy. He puts out so many good tweets and insightful things, and his book's fantastic. One of the things that he's been dialoguing about is this idea of cold calling and how that can be done very effectively or very ineffectively. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are, like in terms of the whole notion of cold calling and how to do that well and how it can be done poorly as well.
Well, I agree. Doug's work is terrific. And I think that when you look up cold calling, you would see lots of examples of it being done poorly and also done really well. And you could see research that would sway you either way. I think it's about building a culture of cold calling. And it comes from, again, the students feeling really having that ability to all speak, so that there's a culture chatting. When I spoke to some of the kids in that initial research, the very first master's research, and asked them about, so it was sort of the unofficial blog of, oh my gosh, can you tell me something about these teachers? The biggest thing that came out of it, and I couldn't write about it because I hadn't, gone through an ethics process to put it into the study itself. But personally, one of the things was that the teachers that stood out as effective to them were ones where they actually did, and a lot of the kids that I asked probably were high achieving kids, the ones the few that I asked at that time. But what they continued to say was that they're teachers who provide equity to everybody. And so they are the ones that...
You mean opportunities to speak, or...?
I mean that if they are asking students to speak, that it's not just the kids who have high cognitive abilities.
Right.
Well,
so they're intentionally seeking the opinions and voices
of everybody.
Everyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even the quiet ones who want to fly under the radar.
Quiet ones, the ones that struggle, the ones that... And this is where I think when teachers know their learners and they know the type of questions that they can ask that they're going to get.
Okay.
Having high expectations of all. And so that's why I mentioned previously that if you're doing group work, I think that it's quite... What I've found is it's quite ineffective to set up roles and responsibilities for group members. And I think, again, with all best intention, group work, people want to do it well. And so over time, people have said, well, if there's a recorder and a timer and these people but it takes away from the thinking itself. And I think that if you cold calling, for me, what I found in looking at all of this work is that cold calling with two people. So cold calling where there's a chance that it not just to be me. We talked to the podcast about, if you're publishing something, if it's just you, it's just on you. If it's you and someone else, you can go, hey, it's us.
Saying. Yeah.
So, I think
so they're in it together with their peers, and if they need to save face, their peers got their back, or
it's both of them.
They're both. There's a kind of shared responsibility that allows them to not be the focal point of perhaps either not answering a cold call question, or showing to the wider classroom that they may not know it all, or they're ignorant of a topic.
Yeah, I also think that things like, say, like a jigsaw method that John's talked about working really well and having an enormous effect size, it comes back to accountability. So if you are going to cold call, that the kids know that you're going to, I'm going to be asking you questions about this, because then there's more chance for them to go, I need to work out what I'm going to say. And so for kids who write things down.
Totally different way of learning when they're thinking, oh, I might actually have to demonstrate this knowledge. Totally different.
And I think it comes back to that, I guess, the notion of the orchestra. So if the conductor is saying, I'm going to cold call, so it's like that culture of building the cold calling.
Be ready.
You're ready, but you're also, everyone's there also saying it's okay to make mistakes. So, but living through that, not showing that's not okay.
Yeah.
But I do think even starting that process of cold calling groups of 4, cold calling groups of 2, and then work towards cold calling individuals when everybody's used to talking. Because, again, for those who can get away with not talking at all and they're there, you don't want to be calling them out when they feel very uncomfortable.
It can lead to a lot of social shame and embarrassment.
Yeah,
they'll probably be less likely to open their mouths next time.
And just lead to, different issues from a wellbeing perspective that you don't want that to happen. You want to be empowering learners to. But I think if you have a culture of cold calling, it's terrific in that it also, if you're doing it in pairs, that means that you're actually allowing the learners and the students to stop for 30 seconds and think together and then share it. And I do think the sharing is important because it does allow for accountability as well, and also allows for other kids to hear what other kids are saying.
Yeah. Think, pair, share. It's pretty basic on the surface, but lots of cogs turn when you promote that in your classroom, for sure. But I'm cognizant that we're going to have to wrap it up. And one way I like to finish things up with is this big questions, little answers. So I can finish on a strong note here. What I tend to do is I ask a quick question, potentially profound question, and I ask for a pithy short response, 1 or 2 sentences. Or I prompt you with just the beginnings of a sentence and I ask you to complete that. So you feel like you're ready for that one?
Let's do it. Yeah, we'll give it a go.
All right, sleeves up. Finish this sentence. Thriving discourse in the classroom looks and sounds like
noisy classrooms that are intentionally noisy and interactive are great classrooms.
That's counterintuitive. Okay, second one. Student voice reaches its highest heights when?
Student voice reaches its highest heights when students are involved in the discourse.
Yeah. Easier said than done, though.
Easier said than done.
Yeah. Especially for those students who want to fly under the radar. I think that's been something that's a recurrent theme in our discussion. It's got me thinking a lot more about that. All right. So the most important aspect of effective teacher talk is?
The most important aspect of teacher talk is not the amount of talk, but the type of talk.
Right. So you go quality over quantity any day of the week.
Yep, 100%.
Yep. And we've covered what the quality is now. So those who've been listening to the podcast, you've got the recipe book for success.
Woohoo!
Yeah. All right. So the biggest strength of our teaching profession, which is not celebrated enough, is?
Well, this one's easy for me. The biggest strength of our teaching profession is teachers, hands down. Best job, best profession, best people. So 100% biggest strength of our teaching profession is or are our teachers, 100%.
I cannot disagree. I think that this time where we've got such a lack of appreciation for teachers in the current climate is so disappointing, because the teachers have their hands on the future. These are the most, in my view, the most influential people in our society. We've got to celebrate them. We've got to empower them. We've got to build them up. And I think, I couldn't agree more. They're the biggest asset to our entire education system. Without them, we don't have one.
100%. And thank you for every teacher who is teaching, because I'm an enormous teacher advocate. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. All right, you got to fill in the blank here. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be doomed.
If we keep being critical of teachers, the education sector will be doomed.
Did you hear that, people in the media?
Yeah, people in the media.
Passive-aggressive hint.
Yeah,
that's right.
Let's only have articles that celebrate teachers and all the great work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's incumbent upon the parents who are listening to this as well. I think we can all have our bones to pick with our children's teachers. But let's recognize and realize it's a tough gig, right? And there's always going to be a higher benchmark about what we all think teaching could be like in its perfect form compared to what's happening, because we live in the real world, and we've got to realize that our teachers are dealing with a messy, difficult post-COVID environment. It's very, very difficult, especially when, the sector's staffing is very low. And there's so many challenges going on right now. And they are absolute warriors for facing those challenges head on and just getting through it. So we've got to celebrate that for sure. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. All right, so next one. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be a huge success.
I guess if we keep doing and understanding more about ourselves as teachers, the education sector will be a huge success, because I do think that part of that is about when we do understand ourselves, and say if we look at teacher talk, okay, so teachers talk a lot because we're passionate and we want to do the right thing. But, again, it's these small tweaks that can have impact and we can be successful. If we talk a lot and we're not doing those, it doesn't mean that we're doomed, as per the last question. But I think that if we keep looking and having this vulnerability ourselves to take on educational research, and I do think that it's changing. Our landscape is changing, where we've got a lot more people who are looking at research and practice together. So are experienced in and have a really deep passion to translate research to practice to research. And so I think having a look at that and seeing what we can do to make a small difference, even if we've been teaching for 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, that we will continue to be really successful and know that we're successful in what we do as we evaluate.
Yeah. There's kind of like an irony there, right? The best teachers are the best students of their own craft. So they're doing all the learning as well, not just their students.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now you've hit the jackpot, Sophie. Got $1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to improve the education sector. How are you going to do it?
Well, I would actually give everyone more money. I just think that, as I said, I've always worked as a teacher or within education or teaching teachers or teaching coaches and, including, AFL coaches or teaching in some capacity. And I think that whilst teachers, we don't do it for money, I do think that if I had $1 billion, I'd be certainly, I don't know that it would go very far, just only $1 billion, but
yeah,
I do think that that teachers deserve to be paid more for the incredible work that they do. And this goes from early childhood teachers right through to the university sector. I think that
amen to that.
it's again that this is teachers and the importance of teachers and our whole educational sector. They deserve to have more, much like teachers and nurses, and it's always sort of that running theme. But I do think that in talking to anyone anywhere, the importance of teachers cannot be underestimated, and I don't think it is, but it certainly needs to be shaped with the money that. So I would share it with all the teachers.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a popular response.
All right.
For teachers. I think that's a good response. And I'm secretly shouting from the rooftops in my heart hearing you say that. Okay. The most important habit a graduate teacher can cultivate is?
This is interesting. I think that the most important habit a graduate teacher can cultivate is blocking out the negativity. And that means, and I mean by that, negativity that may come from the media. We're losing too many good teachers. We are seeing that people are not staying in the profession for long enough for many, many, many reasons. But I think that a graduate teacher goes into teaching because they love to teach or they love working with students, or a teacher saw something in them that they didn't see in themselves. And so they want to empower others or inspire and motivate. And you can surround yourself with positive people and keep learning.
Yeah, especially important in those early years when they've just finished their graduation and they're facing the rest of their lives working in this career. And if they get a hint from others that it's going to suck, that they've got a terrible path ahead, they think they've just had a life sentence instead of a great opportunity and a privilege, to put their hands on the steering wheel of the greatest vehicle of change in our world, which is education. And I totally agree with you. We don't celebrate that enough, and I think we do need to put the spotlight on the good and kind of let that all the bad stuff fade into the background. Okay, so the most meaningful change a school leader can make to improve classroom communication and student learning in their school is?
I think it's a common language of learning, and I guess I'm a little bit biased. That's what my own business that I have is language of learning. I think that a leader, if they're implementing things that to help classroom practice, don't just put it into one or two classrooms. Make sure that everyone has that language of learning. They know what it is. They know how to. And I think that sometimes we need to think a bit differently about professional development. A lot of my professional development, we've learned through COVID that, even recording certain things and allowing people to have access to those things in their own time are going
podcasts
like this
like
one,
this.
Come back to it. But, come back to things when you need them. And, because often, if you're running a PL and you see people are disengaged, they could have a million things on at that time where it's not relevant for them. And so it's not impactful for them. So think about how, as a leader, if you're doing something that it can be recorded in a different way or a different
what our friend Andrew Jones calls those things? Learning artifacts.
Yeah.
I love that term. And you can leave lots of learning artifacts around so that there's not just a one-time exposure to professional learning or development. It's this repeated, it's the way students learn as well. They're not going to learn from one exposure to a topic or a concept. They've got to revisit these things over and over again. And I guess what you're saying is that if you don't catch them in that sweet spot where they're ready to learn as teachers, you might catch them in that sweet spot another time or by another mode of learning. And you've got to be, cognizant of all of those many pathways for your teachers to learn. So last question, and we can breathe a sigh of relief. What excites you most about your work right now?
Well, I'm always excited about teaching, and I don't just say that in a silly way.
Trust me, your passion meter is like off the charts. Every time I see you and hang out with you, I feel like I'm walking away with an injection of energy and passion myself, because it's contagious. That's who you are.
Thank you. What excites me right now is that I've finally finished my PhD, so I'm officially a doctor, but not for that reason, but it means that I can actually get stuck into the translation work. So I really want to think about how, as an educator, I can influence classroom practice, number one, research, and policy. So those three things, of course, always align, and I'd really like to be a part of all three. I think sometimes when we stretch ourselves a bit too thin, we don't do that, but I'm pretty excited about the many opportunities that are out there, and they all come from being a teacher and loving being a teacher. And I love working with teachers. We do say that, everything is about our students, and that's absolutely true. It is. I, started my journey of research with student voice. It's so important. But I do think that to come back to the importance of teachers, teaching, and the power of teaching, and the power of the way that we can influence the future, it's so important.
Beautifully said. I think if anyone can continue to empower the profession, it's you. I have full faith in you taking those next steps in your journey. So, Dr. Sophie Specjal, thank you so much for being my guest on the Powerful Learning Podcast. I'll have to do it again with you. We've got so much to talk about, and I do owe you a coffee.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion with Dr. Sophie Specjal as much as I did. After having time to reflect and to consider what we spoke about, I feel like I've got a much clearer sense not only of what to do, but also what not to do when it comes to effective communication with my students. Let me share with you some of the key tips and the take-home messages that I think are worth reinforcing here. Tip number 1, embrace dialogical teaching. Now, this might mean balancing the ratio so that you do a little less of the speaking and do a lot more of the listening with your students. Avoid monological teaching at all costs. This is where you engage in a great big talk fest and take away opportunities for your students to engage in meaningful conversation because you're too busy blabbing. But engaging in dialogical teaching, it may sound easy, but it doesn't happen automatically. You've got to create the classroom environment where students and teachers can foster meaningful dialogue by using what Sophie describes as a common language of learning. And once these foundations are built, students can have their own learning journey, even if it first is initiated by the teacher, but they can take over and take ownership over their own education. That conversation can run itself. The second tip is to ask purposeful and meaningful questions. One statistic that completely blew me away was that students only ask, on average, about 2 questions a day, whereas teachers ask between 200 and 400 questions per day. Now that's a 100 to 200-fold difference. So one of the first things we've got to do as educators is to recognise the significant difference between the number of questions teachers ask and the number of questions students ask, and try our best to find ways to flip this ratio around. We've got to ask questions that challenge our students' thinking and lead to deeper and more meaningful learning. It means that we do not settle for simple or factual questions that only require one-word answers or true or false type statements. We've got to use open-ended, probing, and perhaps even provocative questions with follow-up opportunities to help stimulate deeper and more meaningful learning. And as Sophie mentioned, connect to the students' personal interests, to timely and relevant topics, and to the world outside of the classroom. Show them that this topic is more relevant than just passing an assessment or achieving a grade or simply ticking boxes, so to speak. Tip number 3, facilitate student-led learning. What does this mean? Well, once the right preconditions for student talk are established, we've got to empower them by giving them permission to take charge of their own learning, to encourage that, to value that, to create a classroom culture that invites that. That means focusing on creating clear learning goals, clear and high expectations, timely and topical prompting on your part, so knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to shut up, intermittent dialogical questioning just to keep them on track and to stimulate their thinking and to stimulate questioning from peer to peer, and even some feedback from time to time would be helpful. So this idea of reducing teacher talk and giving space for students to find their own voice can be really helpful for learning. And Sophie's research attests to that. We can help students see learning as something that they actively engage in rather than passively receive from the teachers. Tip number 4 is to cultivate cognitive task alignment with our students. What does this mean? Well, that means ensuring that our lessons align with our students' cognitive abilities and learning goals, that the language is scaffolded around those things, and we communicate the level of cognitive challenge explicitly to our students so that there's clear expectations from them about which level of knowledge or educational learning objectives we're aiming for. Right, so that the language has to match that desired level of learning, such as the Solo taxonomy, otherwise known as the structure of observed learning outcomes by Biggs and Collis, or even the Bloom's taxonomy by Benjamin Bloom and colleagues, I think originally in 1956, and revised by Crothwell and Anderson some years later, I think in 2001, 2006, and again in 2012. So those are some of the taxonomies that can really help teachers and students build a common language of learning around those clear learning intentions and goals to ensure that there's what Sophie calls cognitive task alignment there. This will also safeguard us from wallowing around in the superficial talk, right? Where we stay in this whole remembering, rote learning phase, where we're just exchanging facts and information, and we go deeper and more meaningful into synthesizing, evaluating, seeing the strengths and weaknesses of key ideas and concepts and connecting them and relating them, not only to other ideas, but to the real world, to concrete experiences that we have. Okay, the final tip number 5 that I have for you, based on my conversation with Sophie, is to model effective communication with our students. Now that means showing them how to listen actively, how to be respectful and empathic to others in those moments of listening. It also means demonstrating how to express their ideas clearly, confidently, and even persuasively at times. So we've got to teach them how to use appropriate communication skills, all the basics, body language, tone of voice, active listening skills. These are all things that we can embody and embrace to enhance the communication so that our students don't end up relying too heavily on us as teachers, so that they can stay on track and make the most of their learning and become their own teachers, right? They end up having their own motor and their own dialogue, irrespective of us as teachers. That's really the goal here, is that you can initiate that, create the preconditions for that, hand over the keys and let them drive the dialogue in the classroom. That's when learning becomes most deep and most meaningful, according to my conversation with Dr. Sophie Specjal. Now that's about all we have time for in today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the release of upcoming content or support this program, I'll include links in the show notes. Until next time, may you continue to learn powerfully.